Okay, so I'm now going to actually talk about Charles Darwin's um, work of evolution. And so, again, I want to make it clear that I'd like you, no matter what, to realize that what we're talking about right now is Darwin's theories, but we're going to focus more on the social effects of his theory. So, I mean, what's interesting is even people who believe in his scientific discoveries are not comfortable with the way that people interpreted the social implications to his science, which we'll talk about in the next section. Um, but ultimately, also, I want to say this. Um, it kind of points this out in the textbook, but not as much as I would have liked. Charles Darwin was not this guy who, out of the blue, said, "Hey, uh, I think there's this thing called evolution," and he didn't necessarily say, "Oh, there's no God and humans come from apes." This is kind of the oversimplified view of Darwinian science, okay? And if that's how you see it, you need to get that out of your head because that's not really a precise way of looking at what was going on. Um, there, there was a trend of different scientists seeing changes happen in the natural world and trying to come to terms with that. Keep in mind that, of course, at this time, scientists, for the most part, were generally seeing science as one of the most spiritual things that you could do. You're studying the natural world which God created, and um, anything that you would figure out about nature was like discovering something else about God. So it's kind of like studying the Bible. You know, the Bible was seen as the revelation of God about what his will would be. You know, there's a scripture in the New Testament that says all scripture is inspired of God, beneficial for teaching and reproving and setting things straight. That's at least one translation says something like that in Thessalonians. So there was this kind of sense that the natural world complemented that. And there's scriptures that even kind of address this fact. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you think the natural world is a part of God's creation, then you're studying God. Well, the problem that we saw going back to the scientific revolution is that many theologians created a very hard-lined idea about what they thought the implications of the natural world were supposed to be. So sometimes scientists like Galileo and others that didn't even say, they weren't saying there's no God and coming up with a theory to discredit God. They observed the natural world, made a conclusion, and it conflicted with the theology that was established. And by conflicting with that theology, it therefore becomes subversive. And in fact, I would argue that science is not a statement about God or no God. It is a understanding of the mechanics of the natural world. And sometimes things they get right, and other times wrong. It mentioned in here that bleeding was something common at the time, right? It's believed that George Washington died prematurely because he was bleeding, getting bled to cleanse himself. These are the kind of practices that happened before, and scientifically now we understand that those just don't work. What Darwin does is not just him, and also he's not mentioned. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was his contemporary, came up with the almost exact same theory as him, of this idea of a variation and natural selection. Okay, so what is it again? And let me just clarify this. Okay, so he believes that one, you have this variety in nature, and you have, I mean, in a sense, I would say that Darwin may have even at times misunderstood the implications of his ideas. Get back to me on that later if you want. I'm not going to harp on this too long. But natural selection, as he's teaching it, is that there's like these variations, there's mutations. So let me just put it this way. Let me make some weird analogy, I guess. Let's say that some strange atmosphere, something in the atmosphere made it so everybody who can see and has normal eyes would get like some brain cancer and die or something. I don't know. Okay, in other words, the ability to actually see kills you. Everybody who's born with no eyes, in particular, which is normally at a disadvantage, have the advantage of being alive. And then a few of those people have the abilities to somehow survive in this world with no eyes and still be able to get food and make babies. Okay? And then when they have kids, so all the kids that are born with eyes die, and the ones that don't get born, that have the same mutation genetically passed on, are going to live. And the ones that are going to, then many of them are also going to die if they don't know how to survive without eyes. So what would happen then is you would be the fittest. A superior genetic disposition would be to be born without eyes. In other words, there was this kind of misunderstanding at the time, because remember I told you there was a trend of historicism at the time, and historicism is this idea that history is moving towards something. There's a comment in the textbook where Darwin even believes that evolution would then lead to a progressive, almost perfection. That's actually not the conclusion of what his science comes up with. What it comes up with is that there's various mutations, and then the environment kind of weeds out the things that are considered going to be useful and what's going to be harmful. Okay, obviously seeing is going to be more helpful than not seeing, but if seeing kills you, then it's not useful, right? And that's it. Okay, so so he has this idea, and it's supported by other theorists, and there were other scientists kind of pointing in the same direction. The problem that it really created for many people is that the Bible talks about in Genesis God making animals into certain kinds, and Genesis is presented as if the world is just kind of made and presented as is. And him, like I'm saying, along with other scientists, say, well, the natural world looks like there is a progression of things that evolve. In other words, that things have changed over time. They weren't always this way. The species that exist now didn't always exist in this way, and many, of course, don't exist at all. And then it gets more complicated than, well, if you're saying that, maybe a cat or, lions or different things if you're saying that life forms have changed in extreme, and humans are life forms, and humans actually come out of a common ancestor with another life form, meaning having a common ancestor with an ape-like creature, now you're demoting human beings into a whole nother realm, because Genesis says that let us make man in our image. That's what it says in Genesis, where God, and he uses the plural. That's another complicated thing to talk about later. But in other words, God's saying makes man in his image. Well, now Darwin's implying that we have a common ancestor with apes. So you can see how this is controversial, okay? The fact of the matter is that the science he produces, and later on, combined with some of the information that comes from, for instance, like Mendel and his laws of genetic heredity, which are important. The more science has looked into various aspects of things, the more that Darwin's ideas have triumphed, and that you can really say that the entire scientific community works with a Darwinian model. But I would tell you, since I know a lot of scientists, and I have an ex-girlfriend that's quite an amazing scientist getting her PhD at Cornell, and things she's told me, and my other friend who's got his PhD in physics, not all scientists now are atheists, just to let you know, and they just look at science and faith in very different ways, and they actually don't care to be that engaged in these culture wars, which is why you don't hear about them that much. And I'd say that science now has become much more utilitarian and about making money or what it does. Unfortunately, it's not even ideologically driven in any way in many cases. That's a whole other topic about where it's at now. But what we're seeing is that his idea had a huge impact. I mean, this picture here, it'd be hard to tell if this was actually making fun of Darwin or it was actually people believing in Darwin and totally misperceiving like some of the aspects of what he's saying. But in any case, what we do know is that on a sociological level, Darwin's ideas and other scientists that echoed many of his ideas would be used to justify radical hierarchies, or you could really say radical inequalities. The social implications behind his ideas, okay, were quite, well, disturbing. I mean, I say disturbing. They don't represent the value systems that we have an idea. You know, if people think about, you know, all humans being created equal and that it's not right to see like babies starving and dying or to exploit people to death, even though we still have a world that totally operates that way, we know, quote unquote, that that's not okay. Darwin's is going to be used to justify very outwardly, very coldly and straightforwardly that this is okay in the world, and it's actually, in fact, natural and for the best, okay? And so I will talk a little bit more about that in the next lecture.